Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Hong Kong lawmakers have postponed a debate over a controversial bill that would allow fugitives to be extradited to China after protests blocked roads and restricted access to government buildings. The city's Legislative Council was due to hold the second reading of the bill on Wednesday. The bill has been met with widespread opposition, including from the city's traditionally conservative business community, and prompted more than 1 million of the city's 7.4 million population to take to the streets and protest on Sunday. The decision to postpone the debate came as tens of thousands of protesters once again took to the streets of central Hong Kong in scenes reminiscent of the 2014 democracy demonstrations known as the Umbrella Movement. Protesters began arriving outside the Legislative Council buildings on Tuesday night, where they were greeted by a heavy police presence and bag searches. By Wednesday morning, tens of thousands of mainly young people had arrived in the area, blocking streets and bringing central Hong Kong to a halt. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the Hong Kong protests. Joining me on the program today are Vivek Karju, former ambassador, Major General Ravi Arora, retired, Chief Editor, Indian Military Review, and KP Nair, strategic analyst. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's try and put into perspective and try and understand what's causing these massive protests in Hong Kong.
The immediate reason is, of course, the proposed extradition law. There is apprehension in many minds in Hong Kong that China will use these laws, despite the safeguards that are being put in, to get hold of people they find are critical of the Chinese government. They feel that, these protesters feel that China will slap cases of a criminal nature, even though the criticism is political, and therefore be able to grab them, to try them under the Chinese judicial system. And the mainland judicial system, we know, is controlled by the party, and therefore no justice is possible. But behind all this is the great apprehension in Hong Kong that China is deliberately going along to erode the special status of Hong Kong, which is provided in the basic law. Now, the fact is that the China of 2019 is not the China which negotiated with the British between 1979 and 1984. And as we know, that it is the agreement between the British and the Chinese were to return Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty that is the foundation of the status of Hong Kong. So it's a historical process. The Chinese are really trying to erode this and expand their influence, expand their system in the manner that they know.
Right.
And the Hong Kong people are very apprehensive because they have a certain personality which is quite different from that of the mainland.
Mainland China, absolutely. We'll come to the basic law in just a bit, but before that, I'd like to get comments from the others as well. So, Mr. Nair, what has prompted the government for the overhaul in the current law?
You mean the suspension of the discussions?
Yes.
Well, I think that the Chinese government, I mean the mainland government, takes a pragmatic view of developments in Hong Kong. It is not as if they are ideologically trying to do things in Hong Kong and steamrolling things. If you look back, I mean, by the way, to me, protests in Hong Kong are a 5-year plan. You know, there were protests in 2009. Then 5 years there was nothing. 2014 there were protests, and 2019. So it reminds me of the 5-year plan that many countries have. But the thing is that, see, 2009, the protests were over the national security law, which meant that, to put it a bit crudely, the Chinese wanted to impose police state methods on Hong Kong, like they have in terms of dealing with national security on the mainland. And there were huge protests, and the Chinese rolled it back. The Chinese didn't pursue the law was dropped. But the pragmatism is that in that case they dropped the law. But 2014 was more basic, you see. They wanted China not to have a say in the selection of the chief executive, which is real erosion of mainland control. And that they didn't give in, you know. They decided that come what may. In fact, last month the people who took part in the umbrella protests, as they are called, or the Occupy protests, they were sentenced, you know. I mean, they prosecuted them and sentenced them. So there are things on which the Chinese mainland, they draw the line. They didn't give in. But in this particular case, they are willing to give in, because I think that at the end of the day, the mainland rulers see that there is some rationale in the protests, you know. Of course, democracy activists around the world and bleeding hearts will say that, oh, because 1 out of 7 Hong Kong people came out and protested, so the Chinese mainland rulers got scared. But that is not really the case, you know. I mean, there was room for going back on this, just as there was in the case of the 2009 protest. There was no room for going back on the 2014 thing, that because that would have loosened Chinese control on
So some issues are negotiable, some are non-negotiable, is what you're suggesting as far as mainland China is concerned. General, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. Would you agree with that assessment? Do you believe that the Chinese were always willing to go the extra mile as far as these protests are concerned and give in at the end of the day, and we've seen that as a result? Or is this something that is going to continue to happen?
No, the situation is not that simple. This time the protests have been much bigger than the last 2 protests which Mr. Nair was talking about. The protests after the national security law, they tried to bring in 2014, which is popularly called the Yellow Umbrella Movement, when they wanted to bring in this principle that the chief executive should be a patriot. Patriot meaning having gone through patriotic education prescribed by the Chinese and certified so, if he were to stand for elections. Now, that time, about 130,000 people turned out. This time, according to whom you believe, 250,000 to 1 million people turned out in these protests. So these were much larger. And so tactically, the authorities seem to have withdrawn for the time being. But why I say the situation is more complicated is because as the Hong Kongers move away, or more time passes from the time when Hong Kong was handed over back to the Chinese, 1997, they are becoming more and more suspect about the Chinese authorities' intentions. And whatever has happened over the years shows so, because Hong Kongers believe they have a self-identity. They don't want to merge with the mainland people. There has always been a tense relationship between the mainlanders and the Hong Kongers. The Chinese government is trying through various means to integrate the political system, the cultural values, the legal system, and you know, the news media, their freedoms, their civil rights, everything. They're trying to merge it, even physically, through having infrastructure projects which are integrating the mainland and the Hong Kongers. They are not liking it. They want to protect their liberties. And there are n number of instances like, for example, the political system itself. Hong Kongers supported, return of Hong Kong to Chinese rule under one country, 2 systems, because the Sino-British joint declaration said that the Chinese government or the Hong Kong government would take steps for universal suffrage, for electoral reforms, and all of that will be enshrined in the basic law. Ultimately, the aim was Hong Kong will get universal suffrage. But when the basic law came, the Hong Kongers felt betrayed. the way the chief executive is elected, not by direct election. 1/3 of the legislative council is by direct election. 2/3 is by a constituency of, say, 2,000 selected people. After that, reforms have not taken place. And in fact, after the Yellow Umbrella movement, some pro-Beijing parties have come up, which say that the one party, two systems which are to be reviewed after 50 years, that is from 1997 to 2047, that is not so important. While these, post-Yellow Umbrella student leaders and some other political parties which have come up, they say that there should be a referendum at that time.
Right.
So all the time the tussle is going on. This is just a trigger. These protests are just a small manifestation of the frustrations amongst the Hong Kongers.
All right. Okay. So since we are here, Ambassador, and since we are talking about, one country, two systems, let's elaborate on that a little more, because, I think the negotiations took place between the late 70s and early 80s, that is till 1984. And finally, Hong Kong was given to the Chinese by the British in 1997. So under the basic law, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Hong Kong has kept its judicial independence, its own legislature, its economic system, and certain human rights and freedoms, whereas defense and other aspects of it are controlled by China.
The basic law stipulates that Hong Kong will retain its personality, and it is based, as you rightly said, and I said earlier, on the agreement which was negotiated between Britain and the Chinese. This agreement was of 84. In 1990, the basic law was enacted in China, and it went into effect in 97 when the lease of the new territories expired, and then the whole of Hong Kong reverted to Chinese sovereignty. So, under that law, external affairs and defense are with China, and the Chinese have a system of how they control or supervise the affairs of Hong Kong. Other areas apart from defense and external affairs are basically under this broad supervision with the government of Hong Kong. And you are right, there is the old colonial system, the common law system that we are familiar with, for instance, which applies to the judiciary. There is an elected legislature. The executive, on the other hand, was to be elected through universal suffrage, the chief executive in 2017. That is what was part of the agreement and the basic law. And that is why all these problems took place in 2014, because at that stage the Chinese decided that the people who will be allowed to contest elections for the chief executive would be severely limited, and as KP rightly says, it was to be limited to those persons who believe in one China, two systems. They didn't want a Taiwan-like situation that someone comes and says, I am for independence. They won't have that. So that is there. But more than that, if you see the progress of how the Chinese have gone about it, is really trying to amalgamate Hong Kong with them. Whatever may be the text of the agreement, whatever may be the wishes of the Hong Kong people, there is a certain logic to a central authority, especially a well-consolidated central authority, the authority of a country which is now aspiring to be a superpower, when it comes to dealing with some issues. So what was relevant in 1984? That is why I said the China of 1984 was a very different entity to the China of 2019. And today, whereas KP, I agree with him that the election of the chief executive goes to the very heart of Chinese control. Yet even today, in these protests, I am not so certain. Because the Chinese are very, very sensitive when it comes to criticism of their system. And they are trying to find a way of how to get hold of people who they think are unacceptably critical of the Chinese system. And hence this law. My final point, we've got to think of the personality of Xi Jinping. He doesn't give in easily. Unless he is forced to, I don't think he will readily agree to agreeing to all these demands that are being made, which is really not to introduce the fugitive ordinance.
Right, right, sure.
So, I think that he'll try to, the Chinese will encourage the Hong Kong authorities to weather this storm.
Okay, okay. Mr. Nair, so just to take the point that the ambassador is making forward, you know, if you look at some of the articles and some of what the state media has said, the Chinese state media, they've been saying for the last week or so that foreign forces are seeking to hurt China by trying to create havoc in Hong Kong. So they are relating everything that's happening in Hong Kong to, you know, vested interests really. Is that the case? Is that something that they are very concerned about? The Americans probably lurking somewhere around therein and thereabout?
There has always been an effort to create a color revolution in Hong Kong. I mean, the West tried to do it in Beijing, Tiananmen, of course, taking into consideration that Tiananmen also reflected into a very large extent the popular will and popular aspirations and desires for greater freedom. But the West is not innocent. They have tried to create color revolutions everywhere, you know, from Georgia to Ukraine to Beijing to Hong Kong. So, to that extent, the fears expressed in the state media are true. From the Chinese point of view, they are true, no doubt. But having said that, it's very significant that when the judgment, the prosecution sentences on the umbrella movement accused was announced, the State Department, the statement issued by the US State Department was very, very revealing. They did not condemn it, they did not criticize it. The Trump administration used the word, it is disappointing. Disappointing is very, very mild, you see. So, while there is this trade war going on, incipient trade war between the Trump administration and Xi Jinping, and American desire to control the Chinese and all that, I think Hong Kong is a different kettle of fish, in the sense that, you know, it's not only China that practices one country, two systems. The rest of the world also looks at Hong Kong in those terms, you know, one country, two systems, because there is so much at stake commercially in Hong Kong. And since we are in India, and as Indians, when we look at it, I think we must look at it also in those terms, you see, because we have quite a lot of stake in this, you see. Those of you who have been to Hong Kong, you see Kowloon. I mean, Kowloon, huge sections are India, you know. Rest of Southeast Asia has little India, but Hong Kong has big India. You know, the Indian community, business community, and very wealthy business community in Hong Kong is a matter of interest to us. I mean, they are British citizens by virtue of the handover agreement. They all opted for British citizenship, but you know, Britain doesn't care about these Indian merchants. So in a sense, they are our people and their heart is in India, you know, these businessmen. So we have to take into account the fact that we have something at stake.
Sure.
So we also have to look at it very clinically, taking into account our interests, and the Modi government especially takes into account the interests of NRIs, people of Indian origin.
Sure.
So we must not forget that we have a stake in the Hong Kong situation.
Yes, General, I'm just coming to you. Ambassador, yeah, you wanted to say something.
It's not sufficient to have your heart only in India.
Okay. Okay, it's not sufficient just to have your heart in India. You must do much more, is what you're suggesting.
Money.
Yeah. Okay.
Which they'll never do.
All right, all right. So jokes apart, General. So is there a brewing problem for China, mainland China, in the region there? The Hong Kong protests. You have the Trump administration telling Taiwan that they want to have a $2 million defense deal with them. So, and plus the trade war or the tariff war between the US and China. Are all of these irritants as far as Xi Jinping is concerned?
Wherever there is dissent brewing, wherever there is this kind of hatred between two communities, mainland and Hong Kongers, foreign agencies are definitely going to exploit the situation, particularly because Hong Kongers are permitted to work with foreign agencies, unlike mainland China. Now, when China did agree in 1997 to one country, two systems, they had no choice. 100 years of British rule there had produced a very unique colony, a very different international financial hub. Hong Kong in 2002 had a GDP which was equivalent to 27% of China's GDP. Not today. Not today, it's less than 3%. The importance is going down. The Chinese are deliberately trying to bring down the importance. So in 1997, knowing that the Hong Kongers were used to a very high standard of living, a different political system, a different legal system, enjoying a better economy, they could not have amalgamated Hong Kong straight away. And the mainlanders were not allowed to visit Hong Kong without a permit, in very few numbers. Today, 40 million Chinese visitors come to Hong Kong every year. This also is resented by Hong Kongers. Just 6 years ago, it was 6 million. Today, 40 million. The Chinese say more immigrants are coming to Hong Kong because the age profile of the Hong Kong residents is very high. They're trying to bring in new talent. They're trying to improve the demography of Hong Kong. This is all under the guise of integrating Hong Kong with the mainland. So this kind of situation will always be exploited. The Hong Kongers are not prepared to do this integration. Culturally, they are different. For 100 years, they have got now a mix of British culture and Hong Kong local culture, whereas mainland China is totally local culture. They can't mix. So whether it's, controls over the media or cultural invasion or, the legal, if they say if this extradition law is passed, Hong Kong's legal system will be undermined. It will become, the state will become higher than their legal system. It will not become independent. So there are so many reasons for Hong Kongers to be unhappy with it. Foreign agencies, well, okay, to a certain extent, but not so much. The Chinese should more be worried about Hong Kongers themselves rather than foreign interference.
Okay, there are several implications really as far as this extradition law is concerned, is what you're suggesting. Okay, closing comments from all my guests on, what's likely to happen really as far as this particular issue is concerned. And, Ambassador, what is the underlying problem really? 2009, 2014, 2019, here we are yet again. There has to be an underlying problem.
Well, the underlying problem is, to my mind, is clear. It is that the Hong Kong people want to assert their own personality and preserve it. They don't want to become part of mainland China. They are seeing these processes of encroachment, a dilution of the basic law, the way it is operating, and they don't like it, so they protest. The question is whether these protests will yield results in the long run.
Absolutely.
Or whether they are historically a larger entity like China, even if it maintains one country, two systems, whether the system of the larger entity gradually envelops and seeks to integrate the system of the smaller entity, unless it is in the vital interest of the larger entity to maintain it. I think that is eroding for the Chinese. The Hong Kong is no longer as important, and besides, for China. Besides, I think you made a very, very shrewd comment earlier, where you asked whether what was happening in the region will influence Xi Jinping when he looks at the Hong Kong, the present protests. He will. If you see what the Taiwan, I think, foreign minister today tweeted support for what's happening in Hong Kong, he won't like that. Plus, if the Americans and the others are stoking the flames as they see it by lending support to these protests, or Britain asking that the 1984 agreement should be adhered to, those are sure ways of Xi Jinping digging his heels in, and the outside world can do very, very little really.
In China's backyard.
In China's backyard, he has the stamina to see this through. And my final point is that is the economy of Hong Kong really hurting on the ground? Is their retail trade hurting? Is their stock exchange really getting fully impacted by what's happening on the ground? I think they'll be able to contain this and keep Hong Kong on its merry path.
Right. Mr. Nair, how do you see things panning out in the near future?
Well, whenever there are protests, especially in an authoritarian system like China, by habit we tend to associate it with democracy and human rights and all that. But to my mind, there is a deep and strong underlying element to the current Hong Kong protest, because you see, Hong Kong is all about money. Money talks in Hong Kong. And if you see the way people are lining up, the movement, the corporates, the big companies, the conglomerates in Hong Kong are against this new law, extradition law. Why? Because they are not concerned, the conglomerates are not concerned about human rights. They are concerned about commercial disputes. They are concerned about their money, their businesses. And if this law comes into force, and if businessmen who are accused of white collar crime are extradited to China, business will be affected. You know, for businessmen, it is very important to preserve the British system of justice, British pattern of law, and all that. So, more than democracy and human rights, there is a commercial angle to this.
Right.
And this, to a very large extent, intermingled with other factors, is an effort to protect Hong Kong's role as a place where money talks.
Sure.
And the businessmen believe that this law is against that culture of Hong Kong where money talks.
Right. And General, close the show for us with the concluding remarks.
I think this forcible introduction of such legislation and other measures can only hurt China. But if they are in their long-term plans for integrating Hong Kong, who are we or anybody else? The Chinese, it's fully upon them how they approach it. If they approach it in a violent way, it will hurt China, it will hurt Hong Kong. If they don't want Hong Kong to be restored to its old financial glory, it's their business. But one hopes that they will go about it in a more amenable way with more participation of the Hong Kongers.
All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.